So dedication to two people that passed away in the last couple of weeks. One is Brett Restall, who I knew was a very good friend of my brother and sister-in-law, and Brad Waksman, who passed away last week. Just want to dedicate this year for Aliyah for the Neshamot. And yeah, here we go. Okay, so something interesting in the davening that we do. In davening in Shacharit, if you're in shul, not if you're davening privately, when you do tachanun, you put your Ashkenazim put their head on the lay their head on the arm. Only Ashkenazim, not Sephardim. Sephardim don't do this for some reason. And I just had a look at the Chabad website, and the reason why we do that during Tachanun is that it replaces prostration on a stone floor, which most shuls have, which we're not supposed to do. So that you lay your head on your arm it's as if you're on the floor. So that's what it's done for. But as I say, Sephardim don't do it, only Ashkenazim do it. So it's also like when you come to Israel one day, you guys, if you come for Shacharit during the week or on Shabbos, there's Birkat Kohanim every day after Modim, and on Shabbos, Shacharit, and Musaf also. So that's someone like Gavin. If you make Aliyah one day and you daven in a shul, in a minyan, you'll do Birkat Kohanim every day, and obviously on Shabbos twice, and obviously in the Chagim twice. So
I know, and it stresses me out when I have to do it. I get a bit stressed out. So,
but it's an easy one, and they just call out. It's much quicker than on the Chagim.
Okay,
so you just repeat after the like the person. And
that Mishnah and Neshama have the same Hebrew letters, so it might be an Aliyah for the Neshama. And since Kevin knows them better than I do, I'd like Kevin to read the Mishnah.
If one steals a field from his fellow, an extortionist, masikin, then take it from him, that is the robber. This is the law. If it is a province-wide plague, meaning that the extortionists have appropriated the fields of others as well, the robber says to the owner of the field, "Behold, what is yours is before you." That is to say, he is not liable for the loss of the field. But if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field.
Excellent, excellent. So just to give a bit of a summary of what the Mishnah is talking about, is that you see there's a word in brackets called masikin. And you've also got to play in the words with the matzikin. So the first thing that the Gemara brings in, there's a commentary by Rav Nachman Bar Yitzhak, who said, look, you can read the verse either way, with a tzadi or with a kuf. And basically, we get our sourcing from Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 28, verse 53, and verse 42. So in verse 53, it states in the pasuk, "You will eat the fruit of your womb," and then it carries on the pasuk and it says, "Under the siege and the matzok, that your enemy will oppress you." So what happens is when it uses the word matzok, it actually has this connotation of oppression. And while we're saying that, is that when somebody is extorting money from you, property from you, that creates an oppression, because a pain of torture or death, you would give up the assets that you have. So that, so if you read it with matzikin, with the tzaddik, it's perfectly viable. And then there's another reading, masikin, as you see from the Mishnah, and that's also viable. That's not in verse 53, but that's in verse 52 of the chapter 28 in Deuteronomy Devarim. And it says, slightly on, all your trees, the produce of your land, and the selatzal. What's a selatzal? will inherit. It's basically, you've got this word tzaka and seletzal. It's talking about locus. So why do we use this term locus? Because if you say somebody's gone through your property in South Africa and there's a bunch of thieves and they go through like locusts, it implies one of thievery, because without your permission they can leave your land that has been flourishing with fruits and crops barren. And therefore they're known as tzaka, like a tzakona, which is a test, a trial, a difficulty, and they're going to clock you clean. So, in other words, you can either see it as an extortionist or you can see it as a robbery, either one. So it's proper to call thieves who extort the property of others by similar insulting names. That's what Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says. So whatever your definition, you can certainly deal with that. Now, I just want to read a part of the Mishnah, because if you have a look on the screen, it's a little bit misleading. If you read the first part of the Mishnah and the second part, it seems to be a repetition of the concept. So this is what I was saying yesterday, Arthur. Because the Mishnah states that if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. Okay? So we said that there were two types of robberies. The first type of robbery, Arthur is there, we just can't see him. It's like Google.
And you trust both of them?
Arthur, I trust. Google, I don't.
There we go, much better.
So we're saying, okay, the first thing you have is you have a robber. Now, a robber can become a robber by two methods. The first method is that your boundary markers can be expanded on his property and decreased on yours. Why? You say, how's such a thing possible? Well, today in residential suburbs, you've got a small area of land, and in South Africa, we've got high walls. And in Israel, you've still got construction of apartments, and the parameters are there by the construction of the steel and the cement. But when you're dealing with acres and acres of property, you might create a fence so the animals don't escape. That's possible. But then, even then, you would deal with herding of animals, because it's impossible to control such land, and fences can be broken. And you might have fences to keep out thieves, but you might have a less infrastructurally built fence between you and your neighbor's perimeter, where in the outer public area you have a higher infrastructure sort of fence where the expense is more. So what we're saying is, if your neighbor's a bit dodgy, he could move the boundaries every day. All he has to do is move it by 10 centimeters, and within a year he's pretty much got quite a lot of extra property without you noticing. We call it incremental stealing. So that's one way to do it. The other way is that you've got what you call a hostile takeover. In South Africa, you've got a thing where a person's overseas, they haven't sold their property, and they're squatters. And the law in South Africa supports the squatters, and they can descend upon your land like locusts, and there's nothing you can do about it, and they leave it in a state where even the light fittings are removed. And in that particular case, that's another way to be a robber. But the Gemara is saying that there's another aspect that you've got to consider. And that is that as far as the extortionists are concerned, so you've got two things at play. You've got the robber and you've got the extortionist. So if Yitzchak is stealing from Levi, he can either squat on your land and bring his family, or he can move the boundary markers. But technically, he can't steal land. How can such a thing exist? It's because the Gemara is saying if you steal land, you're not liable to pay for it. What does that mean? Because land, unlike movable objects, can't really be stolen, guys. It always remains on the earth. And therefore, it's always in the physical possession of the true owner. If the title deed is stolen, it's a different matter, because that can be involved with a transfer of ownership, or it could be fraudulently done so. But what happens is, we're saying there's robber stole the land. Reuven stole the land from Shimon, And what happened was the extortionists, who could be a band of robbers themselves, or they could be the king's emissaries, basically descended upon the land and took the land from you. So the Mishnah says if it's a provincial-wide seizure, meaning the king's men took over that entire province or that entire suburb and didn't target the efforts against a single robber, then the robber doesn't really owe the money. So you say, how can that be? He robs. Because basically, the robber took over your premises, or the squatter, and once he's been evicted, then technically he can't steal your property. He's been ejected from your property. That's number one. Number two is that it wasn't a targeted seizure, meaning that if the robber is involved with some mafia guys and he owes them a debt for gambling or drug money or whatever the case may be, they might take what they perceive to be his assets, which are really his gains that were ill-gotten from thievery, and claim it in terms of the debt that they owe him. And when that debt is personal, in that particular case, the robber can't turn around to the court and say, well, it really wasn't mine, or it was my fault, because the court would turn around and say that money was confiscated from you and was directed at you. And at that point, you should have said that the property that was in your possession actually belonged to another Jew. And therefore, upon full disclosure, that would have made sure that they took property that belonged to you. Why? Because if they took property of another, they would be thieves as well, and therefore they would have the full force of the law against them. So A, based on your non-disclosure, and B, based on the fact that it was targeted as you haven't got a defense, and therefore you would have to pay. Okay? So it didn't matter anyway, because as I mentioned yesterday, Arthur, even if the field had remained in the owner's possession, the extortionists, whether they were a band of thieves or emissaries of the king, would still have confiscated the land. It didn't make any difference who was on the land, because it was a provincial-wide confiscation. And therefore, it wasn't aimed at this robber in particular. And since the robber wasn't responsible for the confiscation, he can't be liable for it. Okay, so when you study the Mishnah, it says, and I'm just going to share the Mishnah again so that you can see the fact that it could be superfluous. Now, if you study the wording, guys, you can see that what is the case in which a robber is liable to replace the field? If you're going to make this statement and say it's where the extortionists extorted the robber's field, but did not extort all the other fields in the vicinity, thereby indicating that the field was taken because it was in the robber's possession, that can't be the case. Why? Because the robber's liability in this case can be learned from the Mishnah's first clause. What does it say, Kevin? You read it. It says, if it is a province-wide plague, etc. And the robber says to the owner of the field, behold, what is yours is before you, meaning I was evicted from the land I took from you. And that implies that if the confiscation is not widespread, but it's directed solely at the robber, he's not exempt. But if it was beyond the robber's control and they were targeting everybody, it's obvious that the first clause tells us that where the robber is the target of the confiscation, he's liable, and it would then appear that the second clause of the Mishnah is superfluous. It's saying the same thing. So the Gemara is saying it's not superfluous. Why is the ruling necessary? Because when the Mishnah speaks of a robber, it's actually referring to somebody who showed another person's field to the extortionists so that they would confiscate it. And the Mishnah rules that since he caused the person's field to be confiscated, he's got to replace the field. So what we are saying is that in the Mishnah's case, let me just stop the screen share. Yeah, Kev?
You said confiscated. What, the extortionists confiscated the field?
So we are saying there's two different scenarios here. The first scenario is if I took over your field by every day moving the boundary markers a couple of centimeters, at the end of 365 days, or let's say I moved it half a meter, I would have expanded it to the extent that you might not have noticed, and therefore I've technically stolen your land. So if there's a provincial-wide confiscation, it's kind of not my fault because they're taking everybody's land. So even if you come to me in court, I would have said, listen, pal, it doesn't matter if I move the markers or not. They were there taking everybody's land, so it's not targeted against me. Even if you had that extra half an acre left on your property, it wouldn't have made a difference. They would have confiscated it from you too. Or if I was squatting on your land and they booted me out, I said, listen, your land is before you. I was booted off your land, Kevin. I never could put the land in my pocket. It's not a movable asset, and therefore I'm booted off. And it was a nationwide or a provincial-wide seizure, nothing to do with me. So go take it up with the king's men. I'm off the hook as the robber. Because technically I can't seize your asset. That's number one. Number two, if the robber was there, and the robber was a gambler or drug addict, and the mafia came after the robber and said, listen, give us your land, and you never told me as the robber that it was actually your neighbor's land, and I gave, you took over my land, and my land, actually you gave over to the debt collectors, you're responsible, because this target was only against the robber, Kevin. And if you were the robber, you would be responsible because that's not a provincial-wide search. That's what the Gemara is saying. So why do you need the second statement in the Mishnah, which implies that if it's not personal, you're not responsible as the robber. And the Gemara turns around and says, listen, we're talking about two different cases. One is that it was robbed from you either by the fact that there were squatters on your land or somebody moved the boundary markers, etc. But at the point when it's a provincial-wide seizure, the robber is not responsible because he's just evicted from the land. And if it was personally against him because he owed a debt, he is responsible and he has to pay with cash or the like. The second, so then it says, why is the second part of the Mishnah repeated? And it's saying simply to talk about a different case. And that is that of an informer, Kevin. An informer is like a robber in that person has cost you money. So if somebody informs that you have property and the SARS, the Tax Revenue Service, or the IRS seizes it, or the Kingsman seizes it, it's because of you saying that your next door neighbor's got a huge asset that he never declared in taxes, for example, and it was because of you that the property was seized. So the second case in the Mishnah isn't a person that robs property. It is a person who cost the property of his fellow Jew by his big mouth because he informed upon him to the authorities that he owes taxes or whatever the case may be. I'm using a modern example, not the king's man. But he called the revenue services and says he's got an asset worth 20 million. He hasn't paid tax. He's claiming he doesn't earn a living. He does. And that informer is like a robber in that if he causes his fellow Jew a loss, he has to replace that property, Arthur. Now, why is this novel, Kevin, from what we said yesterday? Why is this a novelty?
Yesterday, I don't know. No.
Okay.
No, but it's just one point. It's confiscated by the state. That's why you didn't use the word steal, stolen. Is that what you, because it was a provincial-wide
No,
decree.
we're talking about two different cases. I'm happy to go through it again. It's not an issue at all.
Because if the guy just took the land, then it's stealing, but confiscate, that's what states or...
So
No. What are you trying to say, Kevin? What he's trying to say is, this is what I understand, is that if your neighbor was stealing your land over time, right?
Yeah.
And there was a nationwide confiscation, and we would take everybody's land. They took you his land and your land. You are basically not guilty because they would have lost anyway. But
They
if
take
you
the
had
land
done
anyway.
something-
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's point number one. Number two is, if let's say you owed somebody money, you bet on the horses and it didn't go well, and they came to your place, and you gave them what they thought was your land, but it was somebody else's land.
Yeah.
Okay, then you got to pay the other guy back, particularly you stole from him. That's what
Perfect.
Damon's trying to say. Okay.
Perfect. And
Yes.
See, it
Okay.
doesn't look
Yeah.
like I'm listening, but I am.
no,
Yeah.
mate, you bright, and that's why when you're missing from the share, we miss you. If it was specifically because you add this sort of value. So, Kevin, what we are saying is the robber can claim in court if his next door neighbor sues him or a squatters appear on his land and they boot it off and he wants to sue the squatters. If people come and extort the land and it's part of SARS, Internal Revenue Service, or any sort of governmental body or king's men, it's beyond the control of that individual if there's a provincial wide seizure, because it's not targeted at his property. It's almost a rollout of asset seizure and confiscation. But if he's responsible on any level because he caused it by either owing debts and the mafia collected it, or somebody tried to collect debts from him and he said this is his property and he just gave them the property of his neighbor, he has to make good and pay it back. And within that category, the second part of the mission is mentioned because we're saying that even if he didn't steal the land, but he just informed that his neighbor had an asset and the Internal Revenue Service came to collect it, he's responsible for causing that Jew a loss. Even if he didn't rob him of his property, but he caused that person a loss, he's liable. So why is
And
that?
then be a snitch.
Don't be a snitch. So, Gavin, why is that a chidush? Why is that such a novel idea?
What about the if it's his if he's got like a lot,
if he's an informer, not a thief?
What do you mean an informer?
The second part of the Mishnah, it presents a different case. It's speaking about inverted commas a robber. And a robber there is not referring to an actual robber, but to someone who showed another person's field to the extortionists, so they would confiscate it.
Okay, so that's what you mean by informer, yeah. Okay, so when people come, so it's the same. It's exactly what Arthur said. I mean, I'm not sure where the Kiddush is, but I think yesterday we were mainly talking about if they did a government-wide thing, and I think today you've introduced the fact that if the guy owes money and they come and get money from him and he misrepresents the land as being his own, I think that's a Kiddush for today. I think.
No, it wasn't. It was mentioned yesterday, but you also continued, etc. So what we are saying is the first case is somebody that Shimon robs a property from Reuven either by squatting on his land with some heavies or family, or by Kevin moving the boundary markers where it's surreptitiously done without being noticed. Either way, Reuven doesn't have a case against Shimon if there's a nationwide or provincial-wide confiscation of the king's men or the Internal Revenue Service of the government, because this was against all citizens that had assets, and therefore it wasn't targeted on that property per se. So the robber or the squatter is just booted off property. He can't really steal land. He's extricated from the land, and therefore he says, listen, your land's before you. It's there. I never took it. The land is always there. I was just booted from the land that I was occupying illegally. And therefore your case is against the extortionist. It has nothing to do with me. However, if that land was taken from him, specifically by debt collectors, he's liable as the robber. Why? Because he had to declare that that land was a land he robbed and it doesn't belong to him, and therefore the extortionist should only collect the money from his property, and it was targeted against him for debts owed, and therefore he's liable. On that basis, he's liable to pay the cash equivalent if he doesn't have property of the same value. So the second case is a different case. It's about an informer. And what an informer is nobody stole land here. It's just about a Jew informing against another Jew to the government, so that about an asset declaration. So he causes him to lose his asset for tax seizure. And therefore he's deemed a robber because he cost his fellow Jew money. not that he actually occupied his land for a time and robbed him, upon which it was taken from him. There was nothing done other than in being an informer. And the chidush, the novelty here, Gavin, is that basically there's something known as a dina din garmi, which means the law of causative damage will be judged. So according to Tosfot, there are two schools of thought. The one school of thought is that causative damage is not seen as damage. What does that mean? Is that if you tie somebody to the pier, P-I-E-R of the beach, Kevin, if you tie somebody there and you wait for the tide to come in and that person drowns, you never physically drown them. You set a series of events, a series of cause and effect. Do you get what I'm saying? You were the catalyst in tying him, but the tide came in and drowned him. That's known as garmi or indirect, which is causative damage. There's like garmi groma. There's indirect and direct damage. So direct damage is when I drown a person. Indirect is when I tie them up and wait for the tide to come in and the tide drowns them. In Shemaim, the person is responsible either way. In an earthly court, only a person that does direct damage, according to some opinions, are liable. Okay? And according to other opinions, even indirect damage or causative damage, meaning you set about something in motion and that caused it, is considered damage. The other aspect of the novelty is that speech is a liability. It's not just an action. So if you tell two guys to assassinate somebody, or you assassinate somebody, ethically you're responsible in Shemaim either way. However, according to law, you never pulled the trigger, so you're not responsible for giving an order. Now, obviously, a series of laws have changed, because in America with Giuliani, you had the RICO Act, which means you could be imprisoned by mere association of known criminals. Okay? And that was to stop the mafia, where the top boss gave the order and he said, I didn't do nothing. I just said, take care of the problem. And that's why they also never used the word, please assassinate John Smith, because that would make you culpable. They'd say, take care of John. No, when I said take care of him, I only meant beat him up a little. I only meant give him a stern talking to. I never said that they must kill him. So therefore, the law is in certain cases different over centuries. But there's a Jewish concept is there can be no agency through transgression. Meaning the person that pulled the trigger knows there's the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill, and therefore they get the death penalty by the Sanhedrin because they directly killed. If they were given Hazroah, a warning with witnesses, aid him, etc., and the person giving the order isn't killed. But in responsible, in Shemaim, they both are. And in fact, the one that did the actual killing might be better off because he lost his life, and therefore it was some kapora for him, whereas the person that gave the order, there's no kapora. They're going to face the music in the next world. So, Gavin, the two novelties are, is speech considered real damage, and is indirect damage or causative damage that sets a chain of events into motion, culpable damage. And that's where this particular case comes. You could say, no, I'm only informing the person. The extortionist could choose to take my advice or not. In other words, it's not necessarily the case of tying somebody to a pier, a wooden pier where the tide comes in, where you know the cause and effect. Even then you could say, it could be somebody untied him. Here, you don't know if you tell the SARS the information if they're going to do anything. So you could say, listen, it wasn't guaranteed. It's not like it's a probability, but not a definitely. So the fact that it's not necessarily a definite, but it's probable, that's the one novelty. The other novelty is that speech itself is not an action and you're culpable for that. So that's the certain opinions. And there's also an opinion that says that is in fact that the case? Is it a habitual informer that we hold liable? Especially that case of a habitual informer would occur in Babylon, because in Babylon you can't institute fines. Well, you can, but you can't make somebody pay fines. You can only make them pay in compensation. We learned this in the laws of Keren when you had Tam and Muat about enforcing knasim, penalties in Babylonia. You couldn't do, but you could in Eretz Israel. But somebody that was a sociopathic liar or informer, you could, because there was a special fine given, but not the general. So there's another version of the answer. Another version is, what are we dealing with here in the Mishnah's second clause? With the case of where idolaters coerced the robber and told him to show them the lands, and he showed them the stolen field along with his own lands, whereupon they confiscated the stolen field as well. So the Mishnah says, since he caused the field to be confiscated, he must pay. So how could you even argue with that? You can argue with that on the following grounds. You could turn around and say, listen, I only told them about it. It was speech. It wasn't as if I stole the land with my own hands. They were going to kill and torture me. Therefore, I had to save my life, at which that wouldn't be an argument, because to save your life, you can damage the property of others, Kevin, but you have to replace the damage that you caused. And the other option is that you had to declare what is yours and what is your fellow Jews. Do you get what I'm saying? So there is liability, and you would think that there wouldn't be liability, and only with the robber, perhaps because the robber is in some way culpable, whereas this guy didn't do anything other than speech. So we say, no, he must pay. You can't come to that conclusion. So then there was that story yesterday of an exilarch, or exilarch, whatever you pronounce it, I have no idea. It's basically, as Kevin quite rightly remembered, it was like the head honcho in a vassal state like in Rome that ran that particular Jewish community in exile. He was like the archetypical leader. And there's a man that said to the extortionist, listen, there's stores of wheat at the home of this very rich leader, and they confiscated it. And the issue came before Rav Nachman to be judged, and Rav Nachman obligated him to pay. So there were people in the Beis Din that watched this. So Rav Yosef was sitting behind Rav Huna Bachia, and Rav Huna Bachia was sitting before Rav Nachman, because there was an order at which they sat according to their level of experience and expertise. And Rav Huna Bachia said to Rav Nachman, listen, I want to know, does this ruling emerge from the laws of damages, or is it simply a fine? And Rav Nachman said to him, look, if you learn from the Mishnah, it says if the field was taken on account of the robber is obligated to provide the owner with another field. And that's been established as someone has showed the field to another to extortionists. That's the other view. So we can see from this Mishnah that normative tort law demands payment from one who shows his property to his fellow extortionists. So all we are saying is Rav Huna Bachia was unsure of why Rav Nachman obligated the informer to pay. So on the one hand, his ruling might have been normative tort law, which we said normative tort law is a methodology at which you can take somebody to court to pay for damages of what they caused to you. In other words, if you do wrong to a person, it's to redress a wrong and provide relief by awarding monetary damages as compensation. And that's compensation in nature for pain, suffering, medical expenses, loss of income, a myriad of things. And then you've got what you call a penalty, where it's not compensation, but you're trying to deter the person from being a sociopath and damaging society. Now, if it is a knas, a penalty, accordingly, Rav Yosef said to Rav Huna Bachia, what's the practical difference to you, whether Rav Nachman ruled it's a penalty or fine? And the reality is it's different, because according to Rav Huna Bachia, if it's a fine, it's located to that particular case. But if it's causative damage by normative tort law, you can extrapolate this particular ruling to other similar cases. And that was the reason he asked. It had a tangible difference, not in this case, but in application of other cases. So Rav Yosef questions Rav Huna's assumption and says, look, What do you mean you can't extrapolate from the imposition of a fine in one case to similar cases? Even if Rav Nachman was imposing a fine, you can actually still learn from his ruling that fines are imposed in cases of causative damage. And that's where the exchange comes about. Is it only in normative tort law, or is it in fines that you can extrapolate a concept and apply to similar issues where a fine would be there? Because Rav Yosef's question opens this whole exchange between whether logical reasoning can be used to extend a fine imposed by the rabbis as a penalty for one particular act to another, as long as it's similar. According to the Ramban, he sees this as exchange as a proof of his view that Rav Huna bar Chia's question to Rav Nachman, and it just wondered whether the general obligation for an informer to pay his victim is actually a compensatory payment because his big mouth caused the loss, or if it's because we clapped this informer punitively, and you can put this onto another similar sort of case. Okay, now that's so according to this sort of understanding, when you deal with the Ramban and Rashi, they're quite similar in their views, because both hold that the question whether somebody's an informer is a liability is a law of damages or a rabbinic fine. Rashi framed the question as a chronic offender because it's the only way you can get a person to pay in Babylonia. And whether you call it a fine for a chronic offender or just a normal informer, you still have this issue of whether you can deduce laws from fines, or whether it's only in normative tort law where it's causative in nature. Do you get what I'm saying? So that's where the question's going to play out. Am I making sense, guys?
Damon.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we're doing our best. Damon, did the informer inform the extortionists?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I see. So, but what did the extortionists know that the guy had a tax liability? What was the?
So you can apply to. I think Kevin's question is great, because in modern terms, you could say that somebody had a website doing very well on Google and contravened Microsoft's policy, and that competition it irked him that somebody was doing nicely, and he just decided to get this start sandbox where you can say your neighbor's got a lovely home, and he declares no taxes, and I'm going to get him. I've got an iron horror. So let me say that the neighbor's tax submissions were that his poverty struck is not true, because he's got a 20 million rand asset, because if I can't be happy, why should he be happy? So you haven't actually stolen the property. It's just termed a robber because you've robbed him of his property. So you can use that as an analogy, or you can say it's an actual robber that took your property as that person was a squatter who moved the boundary markers. Either way, it doesn't matter, because when the extortion
to lose it, caused like as if it was stolen. The informer.
No.
Caused...
So it's only a case where there's a provincial-wide seizure. It doesn't pertain to these individual parties, so it doesn't matter whether there was a robber or not. There's no responsibility. Yeah. It only matters at which point this individual was responsible for putting this cause and motion into effect. That's the primary issue. Guys, it's pretty straightforward. It's like, did you cause this, or was it something that was going to happen anyway?
And it could have been avoided, but because of the informer, caused someone to lose their land, and had he not been, what wouldn't have happened, basically. It's got nothing to do with the nationwide confiscation due to government policy. It's
guys, there's an interesting word. There's something called Schadenfreude. So Schadenfreude is the emotional experience of pleasure in response to another's misfortune. It's a German word. It's perfectly
SCHAU.
SCHADENFREUD.
Freude. Yes.
Schadenfreude. Yeah. Well, anyway, the Germans get a huge amount of kick out of making somebody else miserable. They've had 6 million experiences to do it. And it's a world where you get joy from another's misfortune. So that's many people. Many, many people. Guys,
Yeah.
it was lovely to see you. I hope the show makes
Yeah.
sense. We're nearly done.
Thank
Bava
you.
Kamma. We're getting
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Let's finish. We'll get there.
Bava's going to come
Okay,
soon.